Greetings, everyone, and good afternoon. My name is Chika Oduah. I am moderating today's session. A big, warm welcome to all of you who are joining us here in Sharm el-Sheikh. I would also like to welcome the virtual audience who is joining us on the World Bank's live platform. This event is all about the just transition away from coal. For me, this is quite an interesting topic. I have a lot of questions for our panelists, and I'm sure that they're more than welcome to tackle some of my questions. So really, what does this transition look like? What can a transition away from coal look like? Secondly, how can we actually ensure that the transition is a just one? So these are some of the questions that we're going to ponder today. Keep in mind that today is Decarbonization Day here at COP27. It's a very big title, very fancy, but all it means is about zoning in on practical ways to reduce the carbon footprint in today's atmosphere. We all know that carbon is still the world's most dominant and most carbon-intensive source of energy. But fortunately, there are some countries such as South Africa and India who are taking huge measures to do away from coal. So for today's event, we're going to have a fireside chat. Then we're going to have our panel members. And if there's time, we'd like to also have some questions from the audience. Let's see how it goes. But at this time, I do want to recognize the SMAP Trust Fund for supporting this dialogue. The donors could not be here with us for this program, but we do have to recognize their contribution. That's the SMAP Trust Fund. So first, let me kick it off with a fireside chat. And joining me for this chat, I'm very pleased to have you with us, sir, Axel van Trotsenburg, the MD of Operations for the World Bank. He's going to talk a bit more about how the developing world can transition away from coal and also how to ensure that low-income families still have access to affordable and greener sources of energy. Thank you so much for joining us. So this is quite a huge mandate. Can you talk about how the World Bank is trying to do measures, especially in terms of South Africa? What are some of the clear measures on ground to ensure this transition is as smooth as possible? It's a very costly transition. We all know that. So what can that look like?
Hear me? Okay, very good. I think the Komati coal power plant captures a lot of the key ideas that we need to follow if we want to be successful. First, we need to think about the decommissioning of the coal-fired plant itself. Secondly, we will need to replace that energy source with renewables. And third, we need to manage a transition, and as you just mentioned, it has to work for the people. And that means we need to have a just transition. So you need actually, and that's probably the most challenging one, is to make sure that the people affected by this have an alternative and that we are thinking about it to either the people who are directly affected, but also indirectly. So I think this is one of the areas where I think we need to think of how we work with the communities, how we work with the government, local government, private sector, local, to make that happen. Similarly, on the renewables, this is the big challenge to see how we can increase private sector participation and do it smart. So these are some of the elements. Now, why I like the Komati coal fire, and what I'm saying always within the bank, is that this is a very good prototype, but we don't want to leave it with a prototype. This will need to be replicated, not only in South Africa, but ultimately we need to, if we want to be successful, for example, in Asia, we will need to close every single day a coal-fired plant for the next 20 years. That means we need to create this type of projects at scale, and the numbers have to increase. So therefore, we will need money, we will need scale, and we need to learn from it. And that makes it so interesting the South African experience because it provides plenty for learning and then for action.
Before we talk further about South Africa, when we talk about this transition, there seems to be two needs that we're referring to. Number one is the need for energy security. And then number two is the need for just transitioning, as you've mentioned. Does it sometimes seem as if there's a conflict between these two needs? And if so, how do we manage this conflict?
Well, I can understand that is when you have, for example, in a country like South Africa that this year has been affected by quite a few outages, that electricity security becomes very important. So I think that makes this whole linkage important, that when you are talking about decommissioning, you got to have the alternative also there. Because if people feel there is even less energy available, that will not enhance the support for the coal transition. I think that is therefore a management issue, but also a very important one, because it will depend also how the people will be with you and understand what we are doing. So sequencing is very important, information is key, and participation is even more important.
To South Africa, the World Bank is embarking on a project, as you've mentioned, to decommission the Komati coal-fired power plant, correct? Why is the World Bank embarking on this project, and what do you hope to achieve? What do you want to see come out of this project? It's a very huge project. Do you have any numbers you can share with us?
Well, I think the very first thing is the World Bank is not embarking on that we found Komati. Okay. The government found Komati. The government has a government plan, and really this is very important, the key ingredient of our success is when governments know what they want to do. And as a function of government strategies, we will be able to accompany them in their effort. I want to be it's very important that a World Bank is not going to be successful if we come and fly in and think we have the solution for South Africa, for that matter, any country. We need to really build on this. And the beauty of this project is that there was a very clear plan. There has been actually a very good dialogue with the South African government that guides us. And that has made it easier for us to respond. And then what the government will feel is, can we bring value added? That maybe in the discussion about decommission, the process, the renewables, but also the just transition, which is a major concern of the bank on the social sectors. And again, I think there where I think what my sense was also from the teams working is, there's been a very good dialogue of force and back, learning, and I think that makes for a successful partnership. And ultimately, I'm therefore also quite enthusiastic about it, because it was really a complementary role that we played.
Thank you for the clarification and for that guidance. If I can ask you to just give us some insights and some observations, what do you think is holding back some countries, especially low to middle income countries, from fast forwarding their own transitions away from coal?
Well, I think we need to be fair to a lot of, particularly in Asia, they are highly dependent on coal. So if you have, concretely, you rely to 50-60% on coal, you cannot turn it off from today to tomorrow. So you will need to have a pathway. And clearly, these are some of the difficult issues governments are facing, that even if they want to, it will cost a lot of money. So we will need also to think how we can bring a critical mass of money to governments. You know, also even in South Africa, the country is challenged by a multitude of development issues. It is affected by multiple crises, like the entire world community, from COVID to the fallout effects of the war in Ukraine, and now high inflation, etc., etc. So it needs to deal with this. And on top of this, the coal exit. So it's understandable that they will need to be able to count on the money. And that is why we at the bank have been making rather strongly the case that a lot more ambition is needed, but that needs to be accompanied with also the necessary financing for the countries that want to undertake such important exit exercise as South Africa is doing, and also some of the Asians are trying to do.
Just one more question popped into my mind before we go to the second part of this portion, which is the panel. If I can ask, what can we expect to see in the near future from the World Bank in regards to trying to scale up these projects around the world? Any insights you can share with us?
Well, I've been saying that we would like, particularly in Africa, a scale-up of our projects, particularly energy access, because still 40-50% of the African population in sub-Saharan Africa doesn't have access. That's not right. We will need to do that, and that is particularly based on renewable strategy. And there we would like to scale up. So I've been saying we will be able to put a lot of money. We are planning to invest only in sub-Saharan Africa, $65 billion over the next 3 years. I think a good chunk could go to the energy things. In Asia, we stand ready to also provide massive financing for the coal exit. But let me reiterate, even if the World Bank does a lot more, we can do that only in a coalition with other multilateral organizations, a coalition with government, and particularly a coalition with the private sector that will need to come in. So I think if we can bring this coalition together, I'm actually quite optimistic. It won't be easy, but you need to have grit.
So I'm hearing you say innovative financing, strong leadership, and creative partnerships are really the key here to getting this transition right.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Mr. Axel. So now we're going to go to the second portion of our event. We have our panelists joining us virtually. Thank you so much. I'd like to introduce the ones here with us in present. We have Mr. Steve Nicholls from the government of South Africa. He's the head of mitigation in the Presidential Climate Commission. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us this afternoon. We also have the CEO of Europe's largest mining company, the PGG, the Polish mining group, Dr. Tomasz Rogala. Thank you very much, sir. Then joining us virtually is Dr. Srestha Banerjee from iFOREST, and that stands for the International Forum for Environment, Sustainability, Technology. So thank you all for joining us. I appreciate that. So my first question actually is going to go to Steve Nicholls out of South Africa. If I could begin with you, we've spoken so much about, here at COP especially, South Africa's just transition away from coal. Can you just break down some of the efforts that are being made to decommission the Komati mine and just the process? It's a very complex one. Some of the challenges about this process away from transitioning in South Africa specifically.
Yeah, sure. So maybe some context. The Komati power plant is in an area called Mpumalanga in South Africa, where unemployment is in the region of 40%. And so you're asking people to accept a short-term known risk for a long-term uncertain future, right? And that's an important part of the context. So the manner in which you run these processes has to be inclusive. It has to include these communities, help them to understand what this future looks like. So a lot of the Komati decommissioning process has been about stakeholder engagement. The technical components, using the land for renewables, using the land for economic diversification, building, so they have a really interesting facility that builds a distributed power system within a shipping crate that they can then sell to other communities that don't have energy access. A lot of really interesting things happening. But the big challenge is bringing communities along. And so built on a sort of consensus-based infrastructure within South Africa, that is kind of how we've proceeded. So part of that is the organization I work for, which is the Presidential Climate Commission, and we produced and Cabinet endorsed a Just Transitions framework, which lays out what we're trying to achieve as a country when we think about just transitions, and in particular the principles of a just transition. So the procedural justice is then a key component, and linking back. So Eskom, the state-owned utility, did a lot of stakeholder engagement, working with communities, helping them to understand why this was happening, why it was necessary to close the plant, what the future opportunities are. Of course, lots of lessons to be learned. We didn't do it as perfectly as we could. There are still communities who don't feel that they were sufficiently consulted, and there's still the labor force, and part of the labor force feels they weren't sufficiently consulted. So this is an ongoing thing, but as Axel said, the real benefit is a pilot. We've done the work, we've established the institutional infrastructure to do it again and again and again. And as you say, number of coal-fired power plants, fortunately not one every day, but certainly 4 or 5 in the next decade. And so that is something we're able to replicate and improve on over time.
And just some more of the major key points of the Just Transition Framework for South Africa. This is a working document, is that correct?
Yeah, it's a working document. It's one that was also built on a lot of consultation. So we went and talked with communities, we went and talked with workers, helped to understand what their priorities were for the transition. And it's built really around three key principles: the principles of procedural, distributive, and restorative justice. And restorative justice in South Africa is very important given our particular history. And then it goes through looking at how would you identify and work with vulnerable groups, and what are the levers that you can pull. And you see some of them being pulled in the Komati project. And those levers include finance, which we've done with the World Bank and some others. It includes consultative governance processes. And a key one that is really important is economic diversification. And the one area we need to think about, I think, a lot more is we have this idea that a just transition is parity. We replace the same amount of jobs that we lose as we transition these coal plants away. But in reality, as I said, these are operating in regions that have 40% unemployment. So it's not enough to create a one-for-one swap. We have to do this in a way that actually creates more jobs and more opportunities for other people and brings that unemployment down to globally accepted levels. So that's perhaps an area we can think about in future.
Okay. My sincere apologies. I did not introduce you, sir. Please accept my apologies. Joining us also in the panel is Mr. Marc Vanheukelen. He is serving as the European Commissioner's Climate Envoy. Thank you so much for joining us, sir. Can you just speak to us a bit more about how the EU is also trying to support these transition processes in low to middle income countries, specifically for European Commission?
Well, in Europe, we have quite a bit of experience with regional reconversion of mining areas. Out of the 27 countries in the European Union, I would say that 8 or 9 have closed their mines over the last 20, 30 years. So we know what it takes to get to a more or less successful regional reconversion in terms of the mining community, then more broadly as well. So what do you do for reskilling? What do you do for economic diversification? What we have done in the European Union is, first of all, create an exchange platform. Currently, we are closing mines in a number of Eastern European countries, Poland, Slovakia. We are working with the Western Balkans, also with Ukraine, until recently, on this question of reconversion. But a just energy transition is about it being just. You've got to make sure that those who are negatively affected by the energy transition are brought along. And that is about, obviously, finding alternative employment, economic diversification, and electricity affordability. But it's also about making sure that the transition is as cost-effective as possible. And for that, you not only need financial support, you also need technical support with regard to policy reform. We know that the investment needs are huge. I mean, take the case of South Africa. The just energy transition investment plan that was adopted last week speaks of an investment need of close to $95 billion. What the international community has brought to bear is $8.5 billion. So we were never going to bridge that gap with public money. You've got to ask yourself the question, what is the policy reform you need to bring in the private capital that brings the investment? But clearly the just element is important. Now the just element is country specific, country unique. The just dimension in South Africa is very different from the just dimension in other countries we are pursuing a JP with. Take Indonesia or Vietnam. In Vietnam, you're going to have, or you have a country with a growth rate of 6-7% a year. There, the reconversion takes place in a very different environment from the one of South Africa. So it's got to be bespoke. Every country is unique, the challenges are unique, and you've got to have a tailor-made response. But on the other hand, there are a number of features that are common, and there you can learn from the past in other countries.
You've hit on so many points I'd love to explore, but we don't have too much time. But if I can ask you to talk more about the transition in the EU. You mentioned alternative forms of income for families. Can you perhaps mention a success story and what that looks like exactly?
Well, the advantage in Europe, of course, is that we have a pretty developed social safety net. So when people get unemployed, they get unemployment benefits. Obviously, they are then getting vocational training. I know that in emerging countries, in developing countries, that's obviously less obvious. But you've got to find alternative employment for these people. As you say, we're asking those people to make a pretty tough adjustment for an uncertain future. And so you've got to make sure that through renewables, through the closure of mines, looking after the methane leaks and whatnot, that create alternative employment. I think that is what is going to happen in South Africa, but obviously it's going to be an undertaking.
And while we're talking about closing of mining lands, I'd like to bring in Dr. Rogala at this point. What has been your experience in repurposing mining lands and other assets?
Good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, thank you for invitation, but this is very important for me, for my company, the possibility of speaking of this panel. Few words about our whole history. 30 years ago, we produced in Poland over 150 million ton coal per year. Now is just a little over 40. That means that we liquidate our mining sector, in fact, since over 30 years. But this first stage was very, very bad for us because this first liquidation 25 years ago was very quick and very, very fast. And this quick process brings us to many negative social and economic results. These mines in Poland were closed in small city, in small areas, in very fast and very quick time. In fact, with no plan what to do with people, what to do with post-mining areas, and final result of this protest, this was chaotically liquidation, divided areas for closure elements, and this all have had for us very negative consequence. Later, this was more or less 20 years ago, we created in Poland economic zones, and these economic zones slowly looked for new investor for these post-mining areas. And we can see now that a lot of these areas is full of new modern companies and full of new other facilities. In Poland, on the site, on the former mines, we are, for example, Silesian Museum and Congress Center. In 2018, the COP24 climate summit was held in this place. But I would like to highlight, underline two words, very important two words: time and plan. If we look if we look at the Polish case, if we look at this previous liquidation process, we see mines, a lot of mines in small cities, typically mine cities, away from large agglomeration, away from large cities, which especially needed to receive adequate support quickly. And it didn't happen. That was a very big problem. These negative consequences were extensive unemployment, migrations, and next, loss of competences. I mean about Down Silesia, I mean about Bytom, I mean about, I think about Lower Silesia and Zagłębie Wałbrzyskie. And we can see to this day negative consequences, this quickly, fast mining liquidation. And the first conclusion after that was we must have a closure plan, detailed, very detailed closure plan. We must create an investment model for this area. We have to imagine, we have to see how we can use in future post-mining areas, post-mining lands when we currently produce coal, now, when we produce now. According to Polish Mining Group, our case is new because of we are the biggest Polish and European hardcore producer. This is true. About we are under the transition process. It just means we are implementing a detailed mine closure plan. On the timeline, we have the date of termination of operation of individual units, and it is more or less evenly distributed. Why? We must see the current value of mining sector. This value consists of four elements. First, very well located lands, real estate, with access to high voltage, with access to railroad, with access to mine roads and other very important elements of infrastructures. I repeat, this element, this infrastructures is very, very expensive. It's very expensive to reconstruction. Next element, very important, they are people, because of we are a lot of workers with very high competencies. We should remember that modern mines, this is a lot of high advanced machinery equipment. That means a lot of engineers and technicians. Next element, this is big annual turnover on PGG case. This is more or less.
Dr. Rogala, if I can just come in at this point, you mentioned people. That's a very good segue. So I want to bring in Mrs. Banerjee to the conversation. Your focus is on social justice implementation. So we've heard him mention people and the importance of making sure that they're not left behind. What do you think are some of the key points to making sure that families, low-income families who are living in these coal mining regions are not left behind as we advance the transition away from coal?
Yeah, thanks, Chika. Thanks, for bringing this on. The thing is that how you plan a just transition is very much tied to the political economy context of the fossil fuel region. For here, we are talking of coal regions. And the transition planning is not just about substituting one industry with the other. It is also about ensuring that we do not repeat the mistakes of the past when many of the industries came in. So where people lost land or their livelihoods, and the benefits of industry was restricted to a few. Now here is an opportunity, therefore, to rewrite the social contract, as we say, and in a way through a good economic diversification planning. And it should be a broad-based socio-economic planning, as I said, not just for an industry. Now, rightly, for particularly, for many global south countries as well as in India, these regions are poverty stricken. We just heard about 40% in South Africa. In India, some of the subnational districts level, there similar levels of poverty, underdevelopment. So what we need to do is we need to start early on planning even before things close down. And only if you do that, then only you will be able to provide for all. Because this is going to be a time-taking process given the scale of it. There are, millions of people who are dependent, and given the economic structure in these countries, about 90% of them are informal workers or low-paid contractual workers. And the economy should be planned in a way that it can provide for them. The second thing I personally feel it's important, and it will also be important to address many of the gender dimensions now that we discuss of, is to invest in social infrastructure, particularly healthcare and education. Because we are planning for a future where we have a 30, 40-year opportunity. India has a net zero time frame of 27. So we have time. We don't have to do everything today. But what we need to is invest in a future. So one of the crucial aspects will be to invest in social infrastructure. And it is also important to invest in social infrastructure to secure a community buy-in, because there is a very pervasive sense of indirect dependence on these industries. Doesn't matter how much people are earning for it or not. Are they directly employed or not? Indirectly employed. But having a closure scenario is a fearful. So we really need to reduce this fear factor through proper investments. Another thing I would say is will be required, particularly for informal and low income people, is to reform the laws to ensure social safety nets, because many of the industry laws are tailored to the formal workforce who are either departmental or have long-term contracts with the companies. But the people who do not have any social safety net in when industrial facility or mine is closing down are the low-paid contractual and informal workers. And this will require regulatory reform to be instituted on part of the government and invest in, I would say, social security funds, which can provide some sort of transition support. That will be another important thing. And finally, I would say the biggest thing will be, people are have-nots. They really do not know, as we rightly heard mentioning, that an uncertain future. So they really need to be long-term engaged in the process to understand what is coming in the region when this closes down. Not that everyone is getting a lot, but still what is the future holding from them is a message that has to be, given very clearly, but in a very sensitive way, because you need therefore various actors to come in who can rightly communicate. You need a diverse, we say, communication strategy. It can be local media, it can be holding small meetings, it can be putting out many materials, talking to them. Actually, strengthening the local resource base will be very key for this. So these are some of the key factors I would say will be hugely important if this transition needs to be socially inclusive and be responsible for the most people who are at the lowest of the rung of the
Thank you
economy.
so much for those fascinating insights. I'd like to get the EU climate envoy to just comment on what Ms. Banerjee has just said. She spoke a lot about investments and infrastructure. Can you talk about how these two elements, what role do they play in some of the just energy transformation initiatives that you are helping to design and implement?
Well, clearly, infrastructure will be important, especially if you want to have a quick transition from coal to non-fossil fuel infrastructure. What you'll need is massive investment in the modernization of the grid, extension of the grid. That is going to be one very big area for infrastructure investment. Secondly, many of the countries will also have to work on energy efficiency. That also will require a big chunk of investment. So these are the areas where you clearly have to have big capital outlays. But of course, for the just energy transition, you not only need those, say, physical investment. What you'll need a lot, and for that you don't need loans, but primarily grants, is in the reskilling, the vocational training, away from fossil fuels into the new sectors. That is going to be the challenge for the JETPs, that we have the right mix of financial instruments. And that is what will be the future challenge for the JETPs that will come on stream.
Thank you. I'd like to hear, how is South Africa trying to fill this gap with infrastructure investment towards this transition? Also, I'm curious to know, what is some of the messaging that your country has embarked on in trying to perhaps get people on board with what's happening with the coal, the decommissioning of the mine, the power plant?
Yeah, so I guess the investment portion, if we think about the infrastructural benefit of the JETP, is really interesting. So, you know, the first phase of this has also been somewhat of an experiment, and putting together the right institutional frameworks that allow us to do it again. We were saying before that we'll need a lot more support than is currently on the table. And key to that is this investment plan that we launched earlier the week, which really lays out what it is that needs to be invested in across mitigation and just transition. And I would add that the World Bank has done some additional work on their country climate development report that also looks at the adaptation component, so we shouldn't forget that. And it's quite a significant amount of money in a context that where the government doesn't have a particularly strong balance sheet, neither do the state-owned entities like Eskom. And so the finance is going to need to be a very careful and very well-coordinated blended mix of public-private philanthropy, money, taking on risk at different phases within each project. And it's the combination of all of those things that will see us hopefully achieve this just transition plan. So that's kind of key part to the messaging. The just transition is a global issue as well as a local issue. There's an obligation on developed countries to play a role in supporting that, and we're seeing that happening through this process. And so we need more of that, and we need to be get more and more detailed as time goes by.
I guess I'm a bit curious more about the language of this messaging and how it's being broadcasted to communities across your country, South Africa.
Yeah, so the language has to be about a hopeful future, moving away from current situations which are not ideal, from an air pollution perspective, from a water perspective, resulting in a human health perspective, from an economic and livelihoods perspective. And so it's one of moving to energy availability, to new opportunities. And of course, the real challenge with that messaging from a trust building perspective is you have to start to implement. And that's really where the key challenge is. So we can't let go of that opportunity to implement accurately, and that's what the investment plan and the JETP gives us a kickstart for. And again, that puts pressure on all of us, local and international communities, to keep up the momentum. Otherwise, you erode that trust very quickly.
And do you think that people are buying onto this message?
I would say yes and no. They buy onto the hope of the message. I think people remain extremely skeptical about the delivery component. I mean, the transitions are huge. They're really massive. You're basically changing the economic structure of a region and the country as a whole, and you're planning to do that in 20 years. Yeah. And people are understandably skeptical about that, particularly in a context where we haven't got a fantastic delivery track record. We often say internally South Africa's famous for having excellent laws and excellent plans. Right. But now we have to get to the implementation. So I think there's a reasonable, skeptical nature of that receipt.
Yeah. And what was the number one concern that you've heard families express about this transition?
Well, so again, to the point I made earlier, people in this context are worried about today things. They're worried about service delivery, they're worried about access to electricity, they're worried about the conditions of air quality. And when you're thinking about climate plans, you're talking about 2050 plans. And so it's very difficult for people to lift their conversation away from what are my concerns today: no access to work, no access to transport. These are people living in real extreme poverty. And so you have to find a route that's a combination of addressing, using renewable energy investment and other transitions to address immediate problems, as well as pointing to a more hopeful future.
Thank you so much. We have less than 5 minutes. I'd love to have Axel to kind of capture everything for us. But before I go to those final highlights, if I can turn back to Dr. Tomasz, what do you think are some of the lessons that developing countries can learn from Poland's 1990s transition away from coal? The number one takeaway for low to middle income countries.
Okay. Basic information. We have to make plan for current mining gas, and we have to see what we can do in these places, because we have to remember that this business, this mines, this 70 hectares, that is big sandbox, and we need a lot of money for new function. We have to use this element as an infrastructure, very expensive infrastructure, and this current competencies to use in a new function. We have to plan, and we have to look for new investor with new engine, new technology for this area. This is very important. We have to think now about these areas in the next 10, 15 years, and we have to look the new function and new investor for the areas. We need money. This is very expensive investment project.
Mrs. Banerjee, any final words, takeaways at this point, especially from the social justice implementation? Anything that we've missed so far?
Really, I think we quite covered extensively many of the points in this short span of time. But I would say that one of the thing is it will require context-specific intervention, thinking of the scale. And if for social, I would say, we need to understand that it's a very big change that we are talking of. And we need to be careful and strategic about it. And just one point I'll say for us, for all of us to consider, is there are always some low-hanging fruits to start with to build community confidence. For example, in Indian context, there are many mines which are coming to an end of life, unprofitable or low producing. We can start with those mines where people are already themselves seeing a need of change. So if you start with that, build a good model, invest in those regions, then it helps to build confidence, not just of local community, but also of the government in the process. And because it's experimentation, it's a new process that we all are talking of today. So I believe that will be extremely crucial, and multi-stakeholder engagement, even from a social justice perspective, bringing in labor unions, bringing in workers, bringing in political representatives, the local political members.
Excellent. Very well said. Thank you so much, Ms. Banerjee. And Axel, very robust conversation. I saw you nodding your head a few times to some of the insights. What particularly caught your attention? What do you think we can walk away from this conversation having more familiarity with?
I think it was a good conversation, but I think what Steve said is when you ask, well, are people with you? And you mentioned that people ultimately want to see a better future. And it sounds very general, but it is actually that as a starting point, you need a strategic vision where you want to go as a country. And that means that energy is part of this. It's part of the long journey. So you need to have a long view, a view that cannot be limited to 2 years, but you need to look where you want to go. And this is a long walk, and you have to walk together. So I think what you hear also from the various candidates, whether Poland was doing the transition, you cannot do it alone as government. It needed to have the communities involved. It needed the private sector. And you need to build that coalition to be successful. And therefore, I think that is actually the chance. So leadership will matter from the government, and to be a facilitator to bring all the walks of life together around a vision, but then also in the plan to get that done. Government, be it central government, decentralized government, it requires the private sector and very much the communities. And that requires a very good partnership that is also based on a very transparent process. Because I think some of them say, well, there are uncertainty, there are doubts. So you need to have a robust debate. And some people will agree and also don't agree. That is all fine. But if you don't want to have that debate, then basically trust is lost. And so you need, through the process, communicate, and address the concerns people are having. And then maybe unquote, the last part is the financing. Sometimes we hear financing seems to be the number one, but we need actually this soft side we need to have in place. I believe that when we have it, we can find financing. And clearly this will be always a struggle, and therefore we need to have these meetings, put a lot of pressure. All can do better. We ultimately will need to find that money. I actually think that can be done. I think also, as a final thing is, we need in this transition to be in a permanent learning mode. We should not pretend that we have all the solutions. There will be new developments, maybe even new technologies, etc. And we will also learn from not so good experiences. And I think we need there to be sensitive on this and be prepared to make course corrections. I think that is ultimately what will be required. It is a whole society effort, and it should be based on, I think the notion you said, on a better future, Steve, what you were mentioning. If you don't have a vision for a better future, it will be difficult. And then be inclusive and trust each other.
So we all have to be visionaries, so to speak. I like that.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Excellent. Well, now this event on the just transition away from coal is now coming to an end. Thank you so much for joining us. This was very informative for me. I hope it was for you as well. A huge round of applause to our panelists, also our virtual panelists as well. Just a round of applause. And thank you so much.